Hi. First, huge thanks to Louise and the whole meeting team, to Neil, to fellow speakers, to all of you for being here. I hope to be sitting with you next year. Let me start with a question. And the question is, when I say art, what do you think about? Do you think about a time you've interacted with art that was quite cool, like Olafur Eliasson's weather project at Tate Modern in 2003? I feel that's the most English I'm going to sound, talking about the weather. Do you think of someone who's an artistic genius, kind of other than, like Pablo Picasso, as someone whose work sells for millions of dollars at auction? Or do you think about something highly conceptual and provocative? This is Piero Manzoni's, excuse my French, artist's shit, which he canned in an edition of 90 in 1961. The Tate owns number 4. Parenthetically, this was labeled in many different languages and sold at the same per gram price as gold at the time. I also think, in a different related category, of the art of some amazing children I know, and maybe you think of the same thing when I say art. My friend's daughter, Anna, made this work that for me is the aesthetic object of 2017 called Kitty Shooting Rainbows Out of Its Butt. I'll post it to Twitter later. What I hope to offer for us to think about today is a kind of Swiss Army knife definition of art. What it would mean to think about art not as a nice to have or as a leisure pursuit or as, oh, that's the art lady, she brought Play-Doh to our corporate office, but as something that's substantive to the deepest questions of what meaning you want in your life, what you want your life to count for, holding in balance the necessity of serving a greater good with believing that there's something that's yours alone to contribute. And for me, this idea is part of a definition of art, as Neil said, of inventing point B. There's a 1947 essay that Martin Whitaker wrote. It's very difficult to read. I've assigned it. I've seen people practically cry in class. It's called On the Origin of the Work of Art. And he says that a work of art is something new in the world that changes the world to allow itself to exist. So something new in the world that changes the world to allow itself to exist. So for me, what this means is that if you're making a work of art in any field, in your everyday life, in your organization, in society at large, you're not going from a known point A to a known point B, you're inventing point B. And this is the crux of what's really hard to do, the crux of how creativity is a difficult fit with business structure, which is that in the point A world, in which economic systems prize efficiency, one has to make a decision to invest time and resources, and one does not know if that will have any value until one gets to the point B world that your work is creating. I want to just pause for a moment and acknowledge how much we live in a point B world that's constantly under formation. If you think about the things that have changed in our societies in the last 30 years, the last 50 years, the last 2 years, hopefully not the last 2 days, women in the workplace, the ubiquity of air travel, fundamental and profound changes in the structure of family, of working life, changes in the number of children people have in different walks of life. Geopolitics. And this is where I think the idea of inventing point B particularly lands the seriousness of creative practice, which is that we may, by inertia, be creating point B worlds that we don't wish to live in, and it's very hard to know. And so what do you really do with this? What do you do with this idea of inventing point B? I think first, everyone has these 3 different selves that we're all integrating: an artist self, a business self, and a citizen self. And for me, this is very kind of comically lived experience because I went to study painting after already having an MBA. And that's an objectively weird thing to do. And it was even weirder when I did it maybe 15 years ago. And I felt like I was the odd person out for about a decade, which I affectionately referred to as the wilderness years of narrative incoherence. I felt like, I was constantly on the far corners of a twister board or navigating these different worlds and languages. And what I finally realized, and I know this is a self-serving interpretation, but go with me for a second, was that maybe it wasn't me. Maybe it wasn't just that I was weird, but that these were questions all of us were struggling with all the time. How to integrate our practical and creative selves. And if you think about some of the intersections of this chart, the artist-citizen intersection, I truly believe that art is a proxy for independent thinking, and that independent thinking is one of the greatest levers of power in any democracy. I also think that this tension between art and business is the tension between short-term efficiency and long-term value creation, or just the idea of value creation and not extraction full stop. And in terms of the connections of citizen and business person, I think these are things we're actively engaged in right now about money and politics, or if we believe that something is a poor urban development choice, how we make the case for it in many different languages of activism, of financial analysis, and so on. I like to think of art thinking or inventing point B as fundamentally a question-driven practice. A question not of coming up with the perfect answer to the question that's put in front of you, but coming up with the question yourself. So I find that inventing point B questions often begin with either, wouldn't it be cool if, or how can I make this better? There's a kind of optimistic and a pessimistic lens on just sitting for a moment and thinking about what it is that you might want to work on. So I offer a couple of stories on this so that we can kind of meditate on what some of the tools might be, both on the mindsets of art side and on the useful tools of business. Many of you probably recognize the person in this picture who the arrow is pointing to. This is Roger Bannister, Sir Roger Bannister, Dr. Bannister, in Helsinki in 1952. He's running in the Olympics. He comes in fourth, and he's devastated. I think that sounds amazing. But he comes in fourth, he's devastated, and he thinks very hard to himself, is this the end of my running career? And he decides that, in fact, no, it's not. And not quite 2 years later, on May 6, 1954, Roger Bannister becomes the first person in modern recorded sporting history to run a mile in under 4 minutes. Now, this might not seem as remarkable now. The current world record in the mile is 3 minutes and 43 seconds, and that record has stood since 1999. And we know that he did this, but at the time he was running, a few different pieces of this story that I think are relatable for anyone who's trying to find space for a big creative project. Number one, Roger Bannister was not a professional runner. He was training as a resident in neurology. And he had it exactly timed so that on his lunch break, he could get from the hospital to the track, run his workout, come back, get cleaned up, eat a sandwich, and get back to work. So when he was in Helsinki coming in fourth, he said to himself, I'm going to try for 2 more years to run, and after that, I won't have time because I will be a fully fledged doctor and I'll be too busy in my medical practice. The second thing you might notice is that he's not running alone. He's running with 2 friends of his, Chris Brasher and Chris Chataway. They also have full-time jobs. Brasher is a management trainee at Mobil Oil. Chataway is working at Guinness. And they're both also gifted runners in their own right. They're colleagues in the athlete sense. Brasher goes on to co-found the London Marathon. Chataway is literally a world record holder in the 3-mile distance. And what they're doing is they're pacing him so he doesn't go out too fast. And this is a kind of medical study of the expenditure of energy, that his only chance at running a mile in under 4 minutes is to not use any extra energy for anything. There are a couple of people who are also helping them, who I want to mention also because Neil, I think, is in the Guinness Book of World Records. There are 2 identical twins, Ross and Norris McWhorter, and they are the people who rigged a sound system so they could announce the race, and also so they could announce split time, so Bannister could hear what his running time was at the halfway point. They also invited the only journalists in attendance to be there and to record this. And Chataway happened to know that they had a near photographic memory for sporting facts, and he recommended them to the management team at Guinness, and they became the founding editors of the Guinness Book of World Records. The other piece about this is just to say this is a completely ordinary day. They are doing something extraordinary, but it takes root in very ordinary circumstances. They almost didn't run that day. Bannister fell on the floor of the hospital the day before, it's newly polished floor, and he was fortunately okay. The weather was abysmal, even by British standards. There was a late lull in the wind, and so they decided that they would try. And then when they tried, there was a false start, and they had to do it over again. Bannister happened to run into his coach on the train on his way to Oxford, where they're running, and his coach kind of talked him into it. But what I find so beautiful about this film, and the reason I want to share this story with you, is that I think it's very rare in busy modern life to have an opportunity to go all in on anything, to give something everything you have before you know if it's possible or not. So this is Bannister running the last lap on his own. And you have to imagine that at the time, journalists had obituaries prepared for him and for two other runners, an American and an Australian, Wes Santee and John Landy, because they were all trying to beat this record, 4 minutes and 1.4 seconds, that had stood for 9 years. And no one knew if they could do it. No one knew if they would die trying. And I just want to pause and let us watch him finish. I was very fortunate to meet Bannister and his wife, Moira, before he passed away last year. And I went walking on the track after eating an eggplant sandwich that was larger than I thought. So I was like, one of us is not like the other. But I have to say, he was full of curiosity and graciousness in a way I associate with people who are really at the top of their field. And here he is celebrating with Brasher and Chataway. They became overnight international sporting sensations. Even my mother, who was growing up in Arkansas, is like, I remember when that happened. Here they are with Churchill. Why am I telling this to you as an Inventing Point B story? It's because Bannister only held the record for 45 days. So 9 years, the record stood at 4 minutes, 1.4 seconds. And we could complicate that by interpreting it in the history of sporting over World War II. Maybe there were people who would have done this sooner. But fundamentally, he leaned into a frontier of possibility, showed something could be done, and then someone else saw that it could be done and bested his effort. So to me, this is the difference between transformational change and incremental change. And I like to say that art and design thinking as processes are quite related, but art is fundamentally this idea of asking questions, big, messy questions, whether you can answer them or not. And design on the margin is more about iterating solutions. And so the questions that people start with, I think of them as lighthouse questions. They're what guide you forward when you have a direction, but you don't yet know exactly where you're going. And I want to highlight two pieces of Bannister's story in case you want to put it into practice for yourself. The first is the idea of studio time, that Bannister had a job and he devoted his lunch breaks to his project. So what is the amount of time that you have that you could devote to a big, messy question that you can't answer? And two, what is the grace period on the question? How long do you actually have before you have to have an answer to it? Bannister gave himself 2 years, and if you notice the timing, he ran in Helsinki in July of 1952, and he ran the sub 4 minute mile in May of 1954, almost 2 years later. So what is the pressing question you really want to answer? What's the studio time you have to work on it? And what's the grace period before you actually have to have it figured out? So there's an art side to this, a kind of expansive thinking side, and there's also a business side. I want to share one other story to sort of drive that home. This is Thomas Fogerty, who, as you can tell from these props, is a cardiovascular surgeon, one hopes. Since the late 1970s, he's also owned a winery in Northern California. Good job. And when he was growing up in Cincinnati, Ohio, he was a self-professed juvenile delinquent who had to be either busy or supervised. I asked him what that meant, and he said that when he was in school, he'd get bored, and he would literally jump out the window to go fly fishing. His teacher would get worried. The teacher would call his mother. His mother was a single parent because his father had been institutionalized and died when Fogerty was quite young, and they all agreed he needed a job. The only reason he went to work in a hospital was that hospitals were, at the time, exempt from child labor laws, and he was 13. But I want to offer what in America is called a trigger warning, if anyone is medically squeamish. He went to work for a man named Jack Cranley, whose main operating room job as a surgeon was the removal of blood clots. At the time, people believed the bigger the incision, the better the surgeon. And if you had a blood clot, they would open up the length of the artery to remove the clot. Many people died. Many people came back for secondary surgeries that involved amputations. And he said to himself, there has to be a better way. Fogerty had always been a tinkerer. He had made soapbox cars. He sold to classmates. He invented a piece for a moped when he worked at a mechanic's garage, and he knew that the mechanic's garage owned his invention. So he tinkered on this in his attic and also got an IP lawyer very early on. And what he did was he totally reimagined the situation where, what if you made a tiny incision and then you took a piece of urethral catheter, attached it to the pinky finger of a number 5 latex glove, and then threaded it in through the small hole past the clot, inflated the balloon with saline, and pulled the clot out. This device has saved 20 million lives since it was invented, and something like 300,000 lives a year. There's also a story here that's a business story. So this, on the one hand, creates the point B world in which minimally invasive cardiovascular surgery is kind of normalized, but also he had to get someone to use it in surgery, publish it in a journal, and get it made. Dr. Cranley used it in surgery. It was hard to publish. And the way that he got it made was that he happened to meet this legendary surgeon, Al Starr, who had done the first valve replacement surgery. And Dr. Starr felt so sorry for him that he agreed to make it with his partner, a hydraulics engineer. They copied the terms from Starr's contract and gave them to Fogerty, so he got an unheard of 10% royalty. And if you talk to Fogerty, he's very funny. He'll say things like, the balloon catheter was so long ago, people think I'm dead. They think I'm Tom Fogerty's son. But he went on to own 165 other patents because he received a royalty. Instead of getting paid a fixed sum, he got paid a percentage. So that share could grow as his project grew in the point B world. So the first piece of business thinking I would add to this inventing point B artistic mindset is the idea of property rights, of owning the upside. And the second idea I would add is an idea of portfolio thinking, or accepting that this just has to be one slice of the pie of your activities. And again, this is a bit like the studio time. I had a conversation with my brother several years ago when I said, I love the projects I'm doing, but my life is like all throw pillows and no couch. Like I need a big beige structure underneath this. And I changed things around, but I thought about it because there are actually things that were at the time the throw pillow that became the next couch. The Mona Lisa is a great example of this. This was not Leonardo's main project. This was his side gig. At the time, he was working on this massive mural that doesn't even survive because he experimented with building materials and the whole thing fell off the wall. And so the question I want to leave us with is a version of kind of what is the artist today? If Leonardo is this mythic artist of the past, if he were alive, what would he actually be doing? And to me, the most important answer to this question is that he wouldn't be one person. He would be all of us together working to build the future. And this is partly because there's a proliferation of information and none of us can be a generalist the way that Da Vinci was. And it's partly that there's a narrowing of conversational pathway. And so what I would really leave you with is this idea that there's great grace and dignity in asking the question that you really think matters and giving yourself a grace period. Someone asked one of the Wright brothers if they ever thought humankind would get a plane off the ground, and he said yes, but not for 50 years. And then they got a plane off the ground 2 years later. And I've always thought if they didn't take the risk on that question, they might have invented a glider instead. So what I leave you with for your lunch break is maybe to take a vulnerability risk to share some part of a big question or project you're working on, something that feels like private shame that's probably collectively held, or something that's about how you wish the world really were, and then to take a chance on exploring it. Thank you.